Hi and welcome to these classes about designing sound images. By designing a sound image, I mean that you come up with a plan for the proportions of each musical element, but also for the world that will hold all these elements together. I look at it as the creation of a painting with sound. And just like in a normal painting, by proportioning things in a particular way, you can create a convincing perspective. So things will be closer and other things will be further away. Now, why is that so important? It's a great way to create meaning in sound. So it will tell a listener what's important and what's less important. Perspective is a weird thing because it doesn't exist on its own. It only comes to be if you proportion everything in a way that's supplementary. So you can also, if you're not careful, get a lot of conflicting sounds in a mix. So something that is big suggests that it's up close, but it can still be very reverberant, for instance. So that suggests that it's very far away. Now, if you have a lot of these conflicts in your mix, perspective won't be formed and the mix will be somewhat unclear for a listener to listen to. So our mission today is to look at the kind of variables there are in terms of perspective and also how they are interrelated. So if you make a plan where everything paints the same picture, basically, perspective will be very clear and convincing. So that's our mission today. We'll be looking at the recording side of things, so how to position microphones and what kind of influence those have on the sound, but also on the mixing side, so what you can do after the fact to influence perspective. Okay, so let's get started. So the first thing to note is that sound image size is limited. So it's very similar to taking a photograph of a landscape. The photograph will determine where the landscape is cut off. Within the photograph, you're actually free to do whatever you like. So if you stand further away or if you use a wider lens, then you can actually capture more of a landscape. And if you use a zoom lens or move closer, then you capture less, but you can zoom in more on individual aspects of the landscape. So whatever you do within the boundaries is up to you, as long as you realize that if you create a large cutout, automatically the contents will be relatively small. While if you create a small cutout and feature large contents, there's less room available for other contents or for more of the surroundings. So the thing to remember is that the perspective depends on the cutout size you choose. And that size depends on context within the music, of course. So let me play you some examples. I have a song here with a particularly small cutout size. So let's listen to that.
It's easy going through the motions, toy arrangements of a grown man. Wearing hotel slippers with the royal aura of questionable quality under smoke-blown skies. Anyone sick, anyone die, anyone roaming in the wrong direction.
Okay, so this song only features two elements. You have a vocal, you have a guitar, and it won't be any more or less than that. So a small cutout is somewhat appropriate since he would be kind of lost within a big landscape like this. The next example.
Cracked on your wings, they turned your blood.
It starts out with a vocal and a guitar as well, but you can already hear that it's more distant and that it's relatively smaller than what we had before. So this is more of a large cutout already with the same elements present. This has a good reason, because this song will evolve eventually, requiring a larger cutout. So let me play you the next section. So you can hear that if we were to start out with a vocal just as big as the first song, that this section wouldn't make sense anymore, or at least that we would just run out of space, because space is limited. Okay, so while cutout size and subject size are interrelated, it is possible to influence them independently. So what I'm drawing here is a comparison between microphone types and camera lenses, which holds true to some extent. The omnidirectional microphone in graph A being a wide-angle lens, and the cardioid microphone in graph B being more of a zoom type of lens. What I've done here is try to keep the subject size similar in both images, and that means positioning the microphones at different distances to accomplish that. And then you can see differences in how they render the background. In the case of the omnidirectional microphone in graph A, the background is relatively present, so you see a lot of it. But what you see is small in comparison to the subject. And that's obviously because of the close positioning of the microphone to the subject. And in graph B, more of the background is cut off, since the microphone is very directional and it suppresses sound coming in from the sides and the back. But what you see in terms of background is of similar size of the subject, since the microphone is further away to capture the entire subject. So these are basically just two ways to have a similar subject size but change how they are positioned in relationship to the background. One thing to keep in mind is that real estate at the front of the image is more expensive than at the back. So close miking everything and thereby bringing it to the front of the image leads very quickly to a congested image in which you can't see the background anymore. So there is very limited amount of space at the very front of the image, so spend it wisely. The physical size of a source demands a particular distance in order for you to capture the whole thing and still leave some room for other elements. So if you look at the church organ in the left image, it almost fills up the entire cutout, leaving barely any space for other stuff, while actually the same cutout leaves plenty of room around the singer with just a guitar. So in order for you to accommodate big instruments, you need a bigger cutout, or you need to place the big instruments all the way to the back where they take up relatively little space. So the perspective also depends on the absolute size of the source, the acoustic size. Apart from physical size, relative size matters a great deal in how big a sound source seems to be. Maybe it's more important than actual physical size actually. We're talking about musical balance, so the elements surrounding a particular element determine how big that one element seems to be. I have a nice example of this in the form of two songs by the same band, in which in the first song the vocal is surrounded by a bigger arrangement, and in the second song is only supported by a piano. And while the vocal is sung by the same person in the same room with the same microphone, so everything is constant, and it's also mixed in a very similar way, the size of the vocal changes because of its surroundings.
And if I'd only got some ammunition, I would shoot nobody but my own children. Why you crying? Why you crying? And what are you waiting for? It was as a curse that occurred only to me.
I think this is a funny thing. So he's singing softer here. It's smaller in how you relate to it. But actually the sound of the source is bigger, because there's only a relatively small piano opposing it. While in the other song there was like a big arrangement opposing it, shrinking the sound of the voice. By positioning different instruments at various distances from a listener, you'll evoke a sense of depth. And while that's nice in its own right, it has a great benefit to it as well,
namely that you are allowed to use more sonic space in this way. So there's actually more room available for you to position different instruments than when you would put them all at the same distance. So if you compare these two images with each other, you see that in the left image the singer can be very big and very up front, while all the other stuff is still visible in the image. If you were to position everything at a similar distance, like in the right image, automatically everything needs to be proportioned similar, and this leads to a less powerful image with less depth as well. I have a nice example of this in the form of a stem mastering session I did the other day, and I thought that the main problem of the mix was actually that it sounded nice, but that it lacked this differences in distance for the various elements. And so it couldn't be as powerful as I would like it to be. And since I had the stems available, I was able to create these differences in distance. And I can now do a short comparison so you can appreciate the extra space that becomes available if you approach it in this way. So let's first listen to the original mix. Okay, so the weird thing is that the master seems louder and bigger as well, and that's not because it is actually louder. Actually, I've level matched these two examples, so they use up a similar amount of energy, but the extra space that becomes available by positioning things differently just leads you to believe that everything is also louder and bigger. So this is not a consequence of added compression, it's mainly a consequence of the type of reverb and EQ being applied to the different layers of depth. Even if you decide not to use any depth of field, so all the sources are located at the same distance from the listener, you can still have differences in distance between them, but then in the horizontal plane. So I'm talking about the amount of spreading between sound sources here. The mechanism is illustrated in these images. So you can see in the left image that everything is spaced closely together, so elements overlap quite a bit. This creates a dense blend, but it also renders parts of the instruments inaudible due to masking effects. So if you want to increase transparency and make them individually more audible, you can increase the relative distance of the instruments by spreading them out horizontally, like in the second image. While relative distances affect depth of field and the amount of transparency, like we just seen, there's another property of perspective, and that depends on absolute distance. So how close is the foreground element in absolute sense to the listener? You can see in these images that the left one feels more intimate than the right one, and this is due only to the fact that the singer is more close in the left image than in the right image. The closeness is mainly a feature of the amount of perceivable detail. So if you can perceive a lot of detail in a sound, it feels intimate. And that also depends on the amount of reflections being allowed to mess with the sound, so to speak. So if a sound is barely smeared out by reflections, it feels close. While if it's being spread out in space and being blurred, like in the second image, it also feels less intimate because it increases the apparent distance. The amount of attention an instrument attracts also depends on its sound. So if it's bright and has a dense frequency spectrum, it will attract more attention than if it's a thin or dull sound. While of course you can influence a great deal with EQ and compression and distortion afterwards, if you record everything with 1 or 2 microphones, which is still a very nice way to work, you do have to get it right at the source. One way to influence the color of a sound without changing perspective and position too much is by angling the instrument. So you can see in these images that in the first image the cello is angled straight at the listening position, and so most of its high frequencies will be radiated in that direction, attracting quite a lot of attention to the cello. While if you angle it, the sound projected towards the listening position will be relatively dull, and now the singer will be obviously the brightest sound in the entire picture. So in the second picture, she is more in the center of attention. Okay, to sum it all up, what does the perspective you perceive depend on? Well, for one, there was the cutout size, and you can see that as the window through which you perceive the world. Within that window, you can see various objects being present, and they have a particular size. Obviously, they have a physical size, so an absolute size, but they also have a relative size, so they relate to one another in the perspective. They are also placed at various locations, so they relate to each other in terms of size, but also in terms of distance. And then there's the distance from us as a listener to the entire perspective, which I called intimacy before, and that can be seen as the absolute distance from me as a listener to the foreground of the perspective. Now, if you pay close attention, you may have noticed that all these elements are somewhat dependent on the size of the components present in the image. So even perceived distance is related to size. If something is small, you automatically guess that it must be somewhere in the background. It's not entirely true. I mean, if it's very bright and dry, you will still hear it up front. But if you have a working perspective, so all proportions are telling the same story, and then place a small sound within that perspective, it will move to the back. So your brain will just complete it in a logical way, so it will fit the perspective being presented. That makes almost anything, in terms of perspective, size related. So I thought it would be a good idea to finish this class by looking at all the mechanisms I could think of that play a role in your perception of source size. I'm going to be presenting you with 6 graphs, each laid out in a similar manner. So on the vertical axis, always there is perceived source size, and on the horizontal axis, a particular variable that we'll be looking at. So in graph A, that variable is microphone placement, and then microphone distance to the source. So if you look at the graph, you can see that if you record very close to the source, you're actually not capturing the entire thing. And that makes the source sound small, so you're actually hearing only a fragment of the source. And then you increase distance till you get to the point where you capture the entire thing, and then it will sound bigger. But there's also a turning point from which the room takes over. So then the surroundings of the source are getting more important than the source itself, and the source shrinks in size again. Okay, graph B, room size. The context in which you place a source actually tells you quite a bit about how big the source will be. So if you hear a living room, you don't imagine church organs there. So you imagine small sources. So these acoustics, they've taught us something about what to expect. But there is also a turning point. The acoustics have to gel with the source, so they have to actually increase the size of the source. And in order for that to happen, they have to be attached to it. Once you get to a space that is so big as, for instance, the church that you can see in the graph, the reflections arrive so late that they are becoming detached from the source sound, and your brain doesn't hear it as an effect on the source anymore, but hears it as, sort of a separate echo. So then the source doesn't increase in size anymore, but stays the way it is, and the acoustics actually overpower the source. In churches, this can be clearly heard. This closely relates to graph C, but graph C deals with adding artificial reverb, where you have a pre-delay parameter. And pre-delay actually determines when the reverb will start to arrive after the direct sound. If it arrives very soon after the direct sound, it actually colors the direct sound quite a bit, and it gives it a very typical small sound, so you can hear some comb filtering going on, and that actually shrinks the source in size. And then you get to the point where it adds nicely to the source, and it doesn't color it that much, but it just makes it wider and bigger. And then you get to the point which is similar to the church, where it starts to arrive so late that it detaches from the source again. Graph D, dynamics. This has a lot to do with the amount of attention a sound is grabbing. If a sound is always present, it seems important. And that's what happens if you decrease dynamics. You create a dense frequency spectrum and a dense energy spectrum, and the sound is always in the foreground, basically. But there is a turning point, like in any of these graphs, and that's when the sound becomes so flat in dynamics that it also becomes powerless. And if you start noticing that a sound isn't moving and doesn't have the potential to be even louder than it already is, it also sounds powerless and somewhat impotent, if you will. And that decreases its apparent size again. Then we move on to frequency balance. In graph E there is high balance, so the amount of high frequencies. This has a lot to do with the closeness of a sound. So if a sound appears to be very close to you, you will also perceive it as being bigger. But there is a turning point. Once the high frequencies take over the entire sound, so they dominate the sound, they start to imply that the sound source is actually very small in generating all these high frequencies. So the sound becomes thin again. And graph F deals with low balance. Low frequencies imply a physically big sound source. So the more low frequencies you hear, the bigger the source appears to be. But there's also a limit to the amount of low end you can add to a sound to make it bigger, because from a certain point on, the low frequencies start to mask the other frequencies in the sound, creating a dull sound that just sounds far away and boomy. Okay, that's that for today. Next time we'll be looking at adding various microphones together.